Hi, Internet. My name's Noah Stephens-Davidowitz. I often go by Noah SD. I recently gave a talk at the NYU Game Center, which was very cleverly titled. It was called What Makes Poker So Awesome? The purpose of this talk was to talk to people who are interested in games in general, and in particular creating games, and tell them what makes the game that I love, poker, so incredibly cool. Um, a few people found out about this talk and hoped that I could put it online so a larger audience can see that. So that's why I'm doing this right now. But fair warning, this was kind of created for a very specific audience in mind. I haven't modified it slightly. So let's just sort of see how this goes. Hopefully you guys will like it and I won't waste your time. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what makes poker so awesome. Here's a rough outline of what I'm going to say. First, I'm going to sort of race through a bunch of things that would be really interesting if I talked about them in more depth, but I'm just sort of going to get them out of the way so I can talk about what I want to talk about, which is my own sort of weird, vague ideas, which I really like, you guys may or may not like. Again, let's see. So first of all, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Poker is awesome. I assume most of you guys agree with that, but in case you don't, here's some evidence. First of all, it's incredibly popular. You can play it online. Tons of people do. You know, the same's not really true for tic-tac-toe. Here's a site, Poker Scout, that tracks how many people are playing online at any given time. It misses a lot of them, but you can still see that tens of thousands of people are playing for real money at any given time. In fact, in reality, about 250,000 people are probably playing on average for real money. So those are extremely large numbers. Lots of people like this game. That's good evidence that's awesome. In fact, it is so big and popular and awesome that you can play it professionally. I'm a great example of that. I played poker professionally for about 5 years. You can watch poker on TV. In fact, if you're just sort of flipping around the channels, you're fairly likely to be able to find poker at basically any given time if you've got, sort of basic cable. This right here is the World Series of Poker, which is probably the most popular TV show. And it's really kind of remarkable that these things have become so popular because actually poker's a terrible spectator sport. It really was not designed to be watched by an audience. But in spite of that, people love to watch poker online, not because it's a great thing to watch, but because it's a great game. In addition to that, poker moves huge amounts of money, in fact, tens of billions of dollars annually just from online poker. God knows what happens in live poker. That's a billion with a B, which is a very large number. You should be impressed. Poker sites themselves don't make tens of billions of dollars, but they certainly make hundreds of millions, maybe even billions annually, so that's very impressive. There are tons of sort of different communities and organizations and businesses and stuff around poker. There's 2+2 and Pocket Fives, these huge poker forums with really, really large communities. There are a bunch of poker news sites. So these are journalism sites that are dedicated entirely to one game, just to poker. There are the poker sites themselves, of course. There are huge tournaments, of course. There are business conferences, etc., etc. I could have included much more here. In fact, I myself have done a ton of things in the poker world, just more evidence of how incredibly huge this world is, that a man like me can wear tons and tons of different hats in this world. So here's sort of the, 20-second run-through of my poker life. I started out as a poker fan, became a casual poker player, then a professional poker player, then a poker coach, then a producer of instructional poker videos, then a poker security consultant, and finally a poker journalist. There are lots of logos that go with me as well. My point here is not to brag, but just to say, like, the poker world is so huge that there are lots of different careers that you can have, and here are some examples that I know of personally. So in conclusion, poker really is awesome. I don't really think that's up for debate. Any reasonable definition of an awesome game is going to include poker. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what actually does make poker awesome. So there are some really obvious things that make poker awesome. Perhaps the most obvious one is this: money. And I'm not just saying this as a joke. I think actually adding money to a game can be a great way to make it more interesting. Certainly, those of you who are really into playing games like I am, know that games are more fun usually when you take them seriously. And maybe one of the worst experiences you can have when playing a game is when you take it seriously and someone else doesn't. That can be really frustrating. When money is involved, that's no longer a problem. My little $5 poker game in high school, everyone took incredibly seriously. We had a really interesting, fun time. We all thought a lot about the game. We all tried to play our best because there was money involved. Money, of course, adds emotions and things like that as well. So I think money is a really big part of poker, but not really what I want to talk about. Second, there's randomness. Here's my silly way of representing randomness, some dude flipping a coin. Randomness obviously is a really, really important part of poker, and I wanted to sort of dwell on this briefly and talk about what makes randomness so awesome, particularly randomness in a game. First of all, randomness creates unique games. Anyone who plays chess very seriously knows that if you and another chess player play a bunch of games together, you'll start repeating a lot of the same situations over and over and over again, which can be really frustrating and really boring. Randomness prevents that. If a certain situation is just as likely as another situation to occur, then you don't have to worry about that. So that's really cool. In addition, randomness is just really confusing to people. This is a particular trait of human beings. Human beings don't handle randomness well, and being confused can be really fun and really interesting. Randomness can also be really surprising. No matter how many times you see something that happens 10% of the time happen, I think you'll always be a little bit surprised by it. That's, again, something that's unique to people and something that's kind of stupid, but it's a lot of fun. And perhaps most importantly, randomness makes people tell stories. Just walk into sort of any casino and stop and listen, and you'll hear someone talking about how there are lots of kings around today, or how red's doing really well, or something like that. People really find personalities in randomness. And I think that that's something that's really interesting and something that's sort of worth at least contemplating, if not studying. And of course, randomness and money together make something very special. They make gambling, and I don't need to provide much evidence that gambling is a really big thing. There's this gigantic city in the middle of the desert that has, a replica of the Eiffel Tower in it, and a pyramid with a light on top of it that can be seen from space, and all this stuff, and all of this only exists because people really like to gamble. So yeah, gambling is, in its way, really awesome. So that's obviously part of what makes poker awesome. In fact, I would argue that if you haven't gambled, you probably should try it. I know this is a little bit controversial, but if you've never flipped a coin with your buddy for $1, it actually can be really fun to just sort of spend an hour flipping coins with your buddy for $1. I've done this before, maybe for a little bit more than $1, but still, it's really incredibly interesting. And I think if you haven't experienced that, maybe you should. Anyway, poker is not just an arbitrary random game with randomness. It's not like blackjack or roulette. It combines skill and luck in a really complicated way that people are always talking about in the poker world. And of course, once you throw money into that, things get really, really interesting. But that's not what I want to talk about. In addition, poker involves a lot of psychology. Poker's probably the prototypical game that involves psychology. But again, not what I want to talk about. What I do want to talk about is this concept of depth. So I want to say that poker is a deep game. And that's essentially a term that I'm making up. And roughly what I mean by it is that you can study it. As evidence that you can study poker, I studied poker. So here's an example. This is a screenshot from an instructional video that I made in which I was analyzing just one small situation that came up. I probably had, when I was playing, 30 or 40 of these an hour. And I think I spent about 20 minutes talking about the situation. I did some math, I made a nice PowerPoint slide, etc., etc. And I think that the fact that poker can be studied in this way, the fact that you can really pick it apart and think about it sort of as much as you want and never really reach the end, is what makes poker a deep game. And I think it's a really important part of what makes poker awesome. So I want to sort of focus on that for the rest of the talk. So that's my new goal. Discuss what makes poker deep, and I'll sort of touch on what makes games in general deep as well. Some games, certainly not all games. So in order to do this, I want to sort of talk about games as though they're math problems. So first I'm going to argue that games are, in fact, math problems. A math problem needs a sort of question, and the question in a game is, how do I win? In poker, it's not quite so simple, though. It's, how do I win the most money, or equivalently lose the least money? Even that's not so simple, because poker has randomness involved. So in any given situation, you're not asking, how do I win the most money, but how do I win the most money on average, given the cards to come? And even that's not quite right, because the best way to win the most money on average can be different depending on who you're playing against. And I don't really want to talk about psychology when I'm talking about depth, so I want to sort of talk about one sort of fixed frozen opponent. So in order to do that, I'm going to say against a perfect opponent. I'm not going to bother to define what a perfect opponent means. What I'm really talking about here is a Nash equilibrium, if you know what that means. If you don't, you can look it up, or you can just sort of let me say perfect opponent and not worry about what I'm talking about. So games are math problems, poker included. Most of them have solutions. Poker does have a solution. We don't know what it is, but it has one. Here's an example of a game with solution. I stole this from an awesome webcomic called XKCD, which you guys should all check out. This is the solution to tic-tac-toe, plotted in a really cool way. You can see that X goes first in tic-tac-toe, and that big red X in the top left is meant to symbolize that when X goes first, he should move to the top left. And then wherever O goes, we zoom in on that board to find our next move. So for example, if O moves to the top center, you can zoom in there and see that X, there's a big red X in the center there. So if O moves in the top center, we move in the center, etc. So this is the entire solution to the game of tic-tac-toe in a very, very compact way. So tic-tac-toe has a fairly simple solution. Here's a more well-known solution, maybe. This is the solution to blackjack. It's called Basic Strategy. You can buy this on an index card in the gift shop of a casino. This is the best way to play blackjack, assuming some fairly standard rules. So those are really simple examples of games with solutions. Here's a sort of more comprehensive list. I won't be able to show the solution to all these games. Some of them are quite complicated. There's what I talked about. There's tic-tac-toe. There's blackjack, which was solved probably or maybe by Ed Thorpe in 1962. The reason I say maybe is because the first person to blackjack had a lot of incentive to solve blackjack, probably wouldn't want to tell anyone. Instead, he probably went and made a lot of money, or maybe Ed Thorpe did and told people. I don't know. A more complicated game that's been solved is Connect 4. I assume you guys know what that is. It was solved by Alan and Alice in 1988. There's the game of Ghost, which is this really nice sort of spelling game where you and your buddy alternate saying letters and you try to avoid spelling a word. So Ghost can be solved differently depending on which dictionary is allowed, but Alan Frank sort of famously solved it in 1987 with the Scrabble dictionary. Other people have solved it with other dictionaries. Really, really importantly, the game of checkers was solved in 2007. This is a really big deal. Checkers is an incredibly complicated game. It was solved by Jonathan Schaefer. He had a lot of help. The solution is this program called Chinook, which is very well known in these sorts of circles. Checkers is an incredibly complicated game. Of the games that are sort of natural, that weren't sort of designed explicitly for the purpose of finding a complicated game to solve, checkers is by far the most complex one that's ever been solved. So it sort of represents the limit of our ability to solve games right now. If you want to know more about this, you can Wikipedia solved games, and there's a bit of a longer list. A lot of these are there, some of them aren't. But of course, many games haven't been found, haven't been solved yet. Here again, I stole an XKCD comic. This is a list of games that haven't been solved with a few jokes in there, like beer pong and 7 Minutes in Heaven. Chess is a really classic example of a game that hasn't been solved, but that we've been working on forever. You can see that there's sort of a hierarchy of games that haven't been solved. There are games where computers are really, really good, but they just don't necessarily play perfectly. So chess is a great example of that. There's also Reversi or Othello. In poker, things are a bit worse or better depending on how you look at it. Humans are still better than the top computers in most forms of poker and the forms that people tend to play. That's probably not going to remain to be true, but that's some evidence that poker is a bit complicated. So now that I've sort of defined games as math problems, I'm going to talk about them as though they're math problems. I'm going to talk about the concept of mathematical depth. And there's a fairly simple definition of mathematical depth. It's a subjective concept, but the idea is something's mathematically deep if it has a simple description with complex and interesting solutions. So there's a sort of image you should have in your head. Again, this is stolen from XKCD. I love XKCD. Image you should have in your head is this really, really sort of simple, placid surface. But if you sort of spend a lot of time swimming around, you might bump into, for example, a giant squid fighting a sperm whale or a submarine or something like that. So something that's really, really simple on the outside, but has a lot of really fascinating things if you spend a lot of time swimming around in it. So sort of the classic example of something that's mathematically deep is called Fermat's last theorem. It has a very simple description, as all things that are mathematically deep should. You take any three positive integers, a, b, and c, you raise them to a specific power n, where n is greater than 2, and Fermat's last theorem says that an plus b to the n cannot equal c to the n, no matter what. So that's very, very simple, but it's been a really open problem for 358 years, ever since Fermat sort of famously scribbled in the margin of a book that he was reading that he had a solution to it, that he'd proven it. That probably wasn't actually true. It was finally solved in the 90s by a man named Andrew Wiles, but that's a little unfair because he actually had a ton of help from lots of different mathematicians. In fact, a lot of modern mathematics went into solving this problem, was invented for solving this problem. In fact, I was a math major in college. I certainly never studied Fermat's last theorem. It's way above my head, but tons of the math that I studied was invented to tackle Fermat's last theorem, and then it proved to be interesting in its own right. So that's really what we mean by something that's mathematically deep. We mean something that's really, really simple, but that has lots of interesting little structure, or big structure, when you dive into it. So games can be deep too. The basic point here is that they're math problems, so if they're math problems, they should probably be able to have this concept of depth. But I'm mostly just going to argue this by example. Probably the best example is chess. I think anyone who has any rough concept of what mathematical depth is and what chess is would agree that chess is a really deep game. There's the game of Go, which is widely regarded to be even deeper than chess. My roommate is a Go player. He told me it would take me about 6 months to get good enough at Go where he wouldn't laugh at me, at my prompting. So that's just evidence to show that Go is incredibly complicated. You can really, really study it. It takes a lot of study to be even half decent at it. Bridge is a game that people often don't talk about in this list, but I actually think Bridge is an extremely deep game. And I'm, of course, arguing for the game of poker being deep. And talking about deep games is meaningful because deep games are interesting and fun. If a game is not deep, then that means that you can't spend a ton of time thinking about it, you can't spend a ton of time talking to your friends about it, and that's obviously going to cause problems for it to be interesting. A game can still be interesting if it's not deep, but it's a lot harder, in my opinion. So let's talk about what specifically makes poker deep. First of all, there's what I said before, which is just sort of empirically, poker seems hard to study. We've tried really hard to make computer programs that play poker really well, and that's proven to be a really hard problem. people have been working at it for a really, really long time, and AI still aren't better than humans, and we're nowhere close to a solution. Um, but this isn't the most satisfying way to say that a game is hard, uh, or to say that a game is deep, um, because a problem is hard until it's not. It might be that tomorrow, conceivably tomorrow, someone could realize that there's this really, really simple solution to poker that nobody'd ever thought of before. So you don't want to say this problem's hard because I can't find a solution. You want something a lot stronger than that. So that's not a very satisfying answer. In particular, we might be stupid. We might just be missing some really, really simple solution. So we should try more objective things. The most natural objective thing to talk about is the size of the state space of poker. So I'm going to define this by example. Roughly, size of state space is a number of possible situations in a game. I'll use rock, paper, scissors as my example. So rock, paper, scissors, the first player can make 3 plays, either rock, paper, or scissors. The second player can also make 3 plays, also rock, paper, or scissors. That makes a combined total of 9 possible different situations that you can ever encounter in rock, paper, scissors. You could define this slightly differently, but in practice it usually doesn't matter how exactly you define a situation. You'll always get roughly the same number. Rock, paper, scissors, you could say it's 3 or 9. Not really any different. So here's a list of the state spaces of many different games. Rock, paper, scissors is 9, as I said. Tic-tac-toe, a lot more, but still not that many, about 5,500. Connect 4, you start to get into a game that's actually really big. It's got about 4 trillion different states. Remember that Connect 4 was solved a while ago. Checkers, the most complicated game we ever solved, has about 10 to the 20th different states. So to get a feel for what the hell that means, checkers is to Connect 4 roughly as Connect 4 is to rock, paper, scissors. So Connect 4 looks like an extremely simple game when compared to checkers. Checkers is incredibly complex. 10 to the 20th is a number that is too high for you to understand. Too high for me to understand as well. Bridge, I put a star here because I calculated this number myself, which means that it's wrong. But based on my calculations, it has at least 10 to the 42nd different states. So 10 to the 42nd makes bridge to checkers what checkers is to rock, paper, scissors. So even checkers, this absurdly complicated game, by far the most complicated game we ever solved, a game that people are incredibly surprised that we actually managed to solve, bridge makes checkers look incredibly simple. Chess is about as complicated as bridge. It's been estimated by people who are better at this than me, so they have more tight bounds between 10 to the 43 and 10 to the 47. The game of Go is famously insanely complex. It's 10 to the 172. That number completely dwarfs the number of atoms in the universe. It's just way too big of a number for anyone to possibly consider. You should just sort of see it and let your mouth drop and then move on. Poker, on the other hand, or at least 2-player no-limit hold'em with 100 big blinds, which is a fairly simple form of poker, but one that's played pretty often, has between 10 to the 25th and 10 to the 30th states, so that makes it much more complex than checkers, but much, much simpler than bridge and chess, at least by this way of measuring things. But size of state space isn't everything. Here's some sort of obvious counterexamples. These are games with huge state spaces that aren't deep at all. These are all silly games that I made up. So first there's Guess the Order of the Deck of Cards. That's a game that has the number of states is the number of deck of cards, so 10 to the 68, which is about the number of atoms in the universe, an absurdly large number. But really, Guess the Order of the Deck of Cards is not a very interesting game. It's certainly not very deep. You can't talk about it or study it for very long. There's also the game of War, which has more than that, because War, in addition to shuffling, also has, in addition to the different ways that the deck can be arranged, I should say, also has different situations that you can be in mid-game. But of course, War is equivalent to flipping a coin. Flipping a coin is not a very interesting game. For an incredibly extreme example, consider the game Pick the Highest Number. So here's how you pick the highest number. I pick the number 74, and my buddy Joe picks the number 83. Joe wins. I pick the number 1,837,000,000. My buddy Joe picks the number 7.5. I win. That's called pick the highest number. That game has infinitely many states because there are infinitely many different numbers that I can pick. But of course, it's really not a very interesting game to study. It's just sort of weird. And then there's maybe a more practical example. There's what I call I win chess. So here's how I win chess goes. It's again played with me and my buddy Joe. The way I win chess goes is me and my buddy Joe play a full game of chess. We play the whole game out, and then at the very end, no matter what happens, I declare that I win, and Joe owes me $100. So that game has the exact same size of the state space as chess because it has all the same states as chess, but no matter what happens, I always win. And it's a fun game. Those might seem like really, really trivial, stupid examples. Like nobody would ever claim that these games are deep. But the point is that just like how we've been studying poker for a long time and haven't gotten anywhere isn't really good evidence that poker is a hard game because maybe we're missing something. Similarly, it might turn out that whereas poker looks really complicated and appears to have a big state space, maybe it's just trivial. Maybe actually all you're doing when you're playing poker is guessing random numbers, like playing guess the order of the deck of cards. Or maybe when you're playing poker, there's some really, really simple strategy that guarantees a win, so it's more like I win chess, or something like that. So you have to be really, really careful when you argue that a game is complicated because of the size of its state space, because it could be trivial in some way that you're missing. So a fairly large state space is definitely required. You can't have a deep game if it has a really small state space, because if I could talk about every possible state in the game, then I'm obviously not going to be able to spend much time studying it. But that's not enough. You can come up with examples of games with really large state spaces that aren't deep at all. And I would argue that actually, even though the size of poker's state space is really pathetic compared to games like bridge or chess, poker has depth in other ways. So I'm going to argue that for a little bit. First of all, states interact in poker. So there are lots of games, poker included, in which your current decision affects what you'll be able to do in the future. So that means that every time I make a decision, I have to not only consider what that will do for the next turn, but I have to consider all possible future turns. So that's true of a game like chess, for example. If I move my pawn in chess, I have to later consider if that pawn will block some bishop, or if that pawn will get taken, or if leaving that pawn behind will block some bishop, or something like that. There are lots of different things that I could consider. I could consider if I want to move that pawn again later on. With games like this, if you want any chance of solving them, you have to do something sort of backwards. You have to start at the end and go back, because early decisions are affected by future decisions, so you probably want to consider future decisions first, get them figured out, and then you can worry about the earlier decisions. So in practice, what this roughly means is first you'll look for the best moves that actually end the game, the last moves in the game, try to figure out what's best there. Then once you've found that out, go one move back, and then one turn back, and then one turn back. So in chess, this means, find all possible situations that are a one-move mate. Then, given that, find all possible situations that are a two-move mate. Then, given that, find all possible situations that are a three-move mate. And if you did that for long enough, if you could actually go through all the possible situations backwards like that, eventually you would figure out if, when you start out at chess, white wins or black wins. And you'd figure out exactly how, just by going through that series of moves. So that's sort of the rough way that people try to solve these games. It's called sort of the mini-max algorithm. People use much more fancy things to solve games like chess, but that's the rough idea. Poker is worse than that, though, because poker is a game of incomplete information. And it's a game of incomplete information that has some very specific things that make things more complicated. So first of all, poker has a lot of states that are indistinguishable from the current state. So if I'm in a specific state and I have a specific hand, I know my hand, I know the cards, I know the action beforehand, but I don't know my opponent's hand. So there are a bunch of situations that to me look exactly equivalent. In fact, there are about 1,000 different states that are roughly equivalent in no limit hold'em, because at any given point in no limit hold'em, your opponent can have about 1,000 different hands, ignoring symmetries and ignoring the fact that they'll probably fold some of them earlier. So that means that in every possible situation that I'm in poker, I have to consider 1,000 different states. Instead of really being in one state, I'm in 1,000 states at once. And that makes things messy already, but what truly makes things messy is that I have to consider previous states to assign likelihood to the different indistinguishable states. So what I mean by this is if I want to know what the best play is in any given situation, in order to do that, I have to consider all possible hands that my opponent could have, and I have to consider the likelihood that he has each of those hands. And in order to do that, I have to consider how he would have played in the past with those hands, and in order to know how he would have played in the past with those hands, I have to figure out stuff about the past states. So in order to consider the current state, I have to consider the past, and I of course have to consider the future because of the previous slide, so I have to consider the past and the future simultaneously. So I can't solve poker backwards. This is not true of a game like chess, it's not true of many games, but poker cannot be solved backwards. And this is a real computational problem. In fact, people have made up very, very simple forms of poker, and you still can't really find solutions to them because of this problem, because the states are sort of entangled. You can come up with a game of poker that has way fewer states than checkers does, but is still much more complicated than checkers because of this. So this is a really important concept, so I want to sort of dwell on it a little bit. I'm going to provide an example. This is sort of how one's thought process goes in a poker hand. So let's have a poker hand between myself and Frank from NYU's Game Center, who originally invited me to give this talk. So let's give me cards, the King of Spades and the Seven of Spades, and of course I don't know what Frank's cards are. And let's make up some action. Say Frank raises $300, I raise to $1,000. Frank calls, and the board comes down, 4 of spades, queen of diamonds, 7 of clubs, and I want to decide whether or not I should bet. So what kind of rough thought process should I go through here? The first thing I have to think of course, is of the future. With all possible 1,000 hands that Frank could have, what will he do if I bet? So now I'm considering, if I do this, what future states will I end up in? But I also have to consider the past. I have to think, with all possible 1,000 hands that Frank could have, how often would he get here in the first place? Because I have to weight these different hands to consider how likely they are. I have to consider how likely they are to weight them, I should say. And then things get even worse. If Frank knew that I knew that, then what would he do? Maybe he would play differently in the future, maybe he would play differently in the past. And then if Frank knew that I expected him to change in response to my knowledge, how would he change again? And this immediately gets incredibly circular, and can kind of freak you out. And what ends up happening is that the game gets incredibly deep. In essence, if you want to solve poker, this sort of thing here, if Frank knew that I expected him to change in that way, how would he change, means that we have to solve poker simultaneously. I can't just sort of freeze Frank's strategy and decide how to play against it. I have to sort of solve Frank's strategy and my strategy simultaneously, which is really, really difficult. So as a result, this makes poker incredibly deep. In general, games that have incomplete information get really deep if that incomplete information affects how the other player should play. So there's an important exception here. Battleship is not a game that's very deep. So Battleship is definitely a game with incomplete information. My opponent places his ships somewhere. I don't know where he put them. But where my opponent put his ships doesn't affect where he's going to attack me. So when I'm considering where my opponent put his ships, I'm not reading information off of him, and I'm not constantly changing my mind and expecting him to play differently based on my knowledge and stuff like that. In Battleship, he just places his ships, I place my ships, and then we play some separate game. So if you want to make a game that's really, really interesting, this is an interesting route to go. Poker, not Battleship. In addition, psychology sort of comes along for free if you have something like this. The reason that poker has so much psychology, in addition to the fact that people lose money and bluffing is really interesting and stuff like that, is because at every given step of the way, I have to think, what does my opponent think that I'm doing? What does my opponent think that I have? And that's just not true of a game like chess in the same way. It's not really true of a game like Battleship in quite the same way. It's really only true of a few games like poker. So that's sort of more rigorous ways of trying to figure out whether or not a game is deep. There are other ways to talk about whether or not a game is deep as well. One way is to look at how many defined concepts it has. So one nice way to... what you should have in mind here is that image before of sort of the ocean with lots of interesting stuff involved. If I were exploring that ocean, I would probably name a whale and name a squid and stuff like that. So poker players name a lot of things because lots of interesting sort of concepts come up when you play poker. You can measure this really simply by looking at the Wikipedia list of poker terms, which is very long. Chess has a much longer list of terms. It is arguably a much deeper game than poker. Very long list of terms. A game like tic-tac-toe doesn't even have a list of terms because, well, tic-tac-toe is not deep. There's really not that many concepts in tic-tac-toe. I can think of maybe 4 vocabulary words for tic-tac-toe total because there's just not that much that happens. Of course, this isn't a great way to measure how deep a game is. It doesn't work for any new game. It only works for games that people are talking about already. And it also has really strong biases. Like, poker probably has more words than one would expect because it's a gambling game, and that makes it sort of more colorful. It has a colorful history, so people do things like they name different hands and things like that, which obviously really isn't necessary. Chess has been around for so long, that people have been talking about it for so long, that it probably has more words than a similarly complicated game that's created now. But this is still a sort of useful way to analyze a game. If you're considering a game to play, for example, and you want to find a deep game, maybe look for a game with a lot of vocabulary. So that's essentially my talk. I just want to quickly summarize. First of all, poker is in fact awesome. There are a lot of reasons that poker is awesome that this talk was not about. I encourage you guys to think about them and talk about them if you feel like it. For example, money and randomness, and psychology, as well as many other things. One important part, I think, of what makes poker awesome is its depth, its mathematical depth. In particular, poker is a game that you can study. There are a lot of things that can make a game, that can help make a game deep. In particular, it has to be hard to study. A game can't be deep if someone's found a really simple solution, or if talking about it for 10 minutes makes it seem trivial. It has to have a large state space. If the state space is too small, then it might be the case, then it's going to be really easy to study because you can just talk about the entire state space. In addition, it probably needs lots of different sort of interesting concepts that could use names. You know, in poker we have like flush draws, various different kinds of straight draws, top pair, middle pair, low pair, all these sort of different things. The same stuff would not come up in tic-tac-toe. And incomplete information helps a lot, but not like Battleship. Like poker and not like Battleship if you want to use incomplete information. Also, incomplete information, in addition to making a game deep, is just a lot of fun. So I like games of incomplete information. I wish people would make more of them. I would like to play more of them. Um, and deep games are really, really fun. So this video was originally made for people who make games, and I was sort of imploring them to make more deep games because I think deep games are cool. And that's my talk. So I will put in the details section ways that you can sort of subscribe to me if you're interested in this sort of stuff. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this talk.